A kingdom of insolence with breathtaking mountain ranges, between 1996 and 2001, Afghanistan had the misfortune of living under the Taliban, a group of religious fundamentalists trained in neighboring Pakistan. The country became a hotbed of international terrorism and sheltered the organization of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. One man alone resisted them, Ahmad Shah Massoud, nicknamed the Lion of Panjshir, a reference to his native valley. Massoud symbolized freedom, hope, and resistance to the intolerance and fanaticism of the radical Islamists. It was for this reason that on September 9, 2001, he was assassinated 2 days before the terror attacks on New York and Washington. Today, Massoud is a state of mind, a hope of peace, the will to resist and seek freedom. 20 years on, his son Ahmed has taken up his father's arms against the Taliban once again, back in power in Kabul since August 2021. Massoud was the only and last rampart against fanaticism and terrorism. From Massoud to Massoud, this film tells the story of an inheritance and a fight for justice and freedom.
I'm trying to, as much as I can, to learn from my father to continue his path. That's truly, like, my only and main goal, that to be on his path. My father was born in a middle-class family in Kabul. Her father was an army officer, and his mother was a housewife, and they were living a middle-class lifestyle. And my father went to school in Kabul, and that is school that he got to know the figures like General de Gaulle, which he was inspired from. And also it was in that school that he studied French, and I believe it was one of the main reasons that shaped his character. But unfortunately, because of the activities in Afghanistan, because of atrocity of that government at that time, he had no choice to join the revolution. And his conscience wouldn't allow him or wouldn't leave him alone, and he had to join the revolution, and it was the beginning of everything.
Afghanistan, nicknamed the Kingdom of Insolence, was ruled by a king until 1973, when former Prime Minister Daoud Khan led a bloodless coup d'etat backed by the Soviet-trained Afghan army. Ahmad Shah was still only 19, but he had to make a choice. Either to stay in Kabul, continue his engineering studies, and make a pact with the communists, or go underground. Ahmad Shah decided to adopt a resistance name. He chose Massoud, meaning lucky in Dari, the widest spoken language in Afghanistan. Back in his native Panjshir, the Mujahideen, the fighters resisting the communist power in Kabul, called him Commander. In late December 1979, the Red Army secretly invaded Afghanistan to re-establish order in the country and give their support to the Afghan communists. Afghanistan became the theater of what would become the last conflict of the Cold War, a clash between Soviets and Americans with Afghans caught in the middle. The invaders were met with fierce resistance northeast of Kabul, in the Panjshir Valley. Leading the Mujahideen was the young commander Massoud, then unknown in the West. He would be revealed to the public at large in a first French report by Christophe de Ponfilly and Jérôme Bonny.
We hadn't seen any pictures of him before. The truth is, when I first saw him, he reminded me of my favourite singer, Bob Dylan. He was totally at home in his role as a young commander. In the interview, I asked him how he was managing to resist the world's most powerful army with 5,000 men. An interesting interview in how totally natural his answers were. He said, "Our men aren't afraid of dying because they know that when they die, they will enter Jannah." I didn't know the word Jannah. Jihad, I said. "No, Jannah, the Garden of Paradise," he said with a big smile.
Ils ont réfléchi comme ça, ils ont que nous, si nous mourons, nous gagnons Jannat.
La djihad,
Le djihad.
c'est-à-dire la guerre sainte.
Jannat. Jannat. Le jardin de Dieu. Oui. Vous connaissez?
C'est-à-dire que les moudjahides qui meurent gagnent le jardin de Dieu.
Gagnent le Jannat.
After this first report, the hero of the resistance finally had a name, and more importantly, a face. His position under siege by the Red Army reinforced the image of David versus Goliath. But the Soviets intensified their attacks on the valley in an attempt to seize Panjshir.
The Panjshir front line became the main focus of the Russian. That the Russian launched 7 grand attacks and grand operations on Panjshir, with hundreds of airplanes, helicopters, and aerial support, with hundreds of tanks from beneath, and thousands of soldiers, either by deployment as the commando units or by the troops going behind the tanks and the other heavy weaponry, that they had 7 big operations like this to capture Panjshir Valley. But in every single one of them, they could not achieve what they set for themselves. And the victorious was Ahmad Shah Massoud. So the Russians, they changed their tactics so many times. They used to attack only from the ground, didn't work. They added aerial support for it, didn't work. They changed their tactic by deployment of commando units on top of the hills and mountains to really block the movement of Mujahideen and their guerrilla tactics, and also to use their brute force on the ground with aerial support. Didn't work again. So whatever they were coming up with, Ahmad Shah Massoud had a better tactic to use against it.
Fine strategist that he was, Massoud resisted the attacks by the Red Army. In Moscow, as a nod to the Cold War, the supreme commander of the Soviet forces in Afghanistan at the time, General Boris Gromov, still denounces the role of the Americans.
Come closer, I don't bite. The deployment of Soviet troops was received very positively by the Americans because it was something they wanted. They wanted the Soviet Union to embark on a military intervention, and nothing could be better for them than Afghanistan. So they were delighted. It was clear that the US and other Western powers would do all they could to force the Soviet Union to get bogged down in a war, which would weaken it economically, militarily, and politically. And that's exactly what happened with Afghanistan.
À partir du moment où les États-Unis ont décidé
The moment the United States decided, in 1985, that Afghan resistance should last, and when international Muslim opinion was convinced it wasn't merely a war between the Soviet Union and the USA, with Afghans in the middle, that Afghan resistance was real, deeply felt, and very Muslim. The Reagan administration thought it had the necessary political cover, along with their Pakistani allies, to supply the resistance fighters with anti-aircraft artillery. After that, supplies were dropped day and night. Literally.
And so it was that the major part of American aid supplies, and notably weapons and munitions, fell into the hands of radical fundamentalist groups. One of them, a group that would soon be headed by a certain Osama bin Laden. In Panjshir, however, despite all that was said and written, no American aid arrived.
Je dis clairement que nous n'avons pas de relation directe ou indirecte avec les Américains. Et aux dernières attaques, aucun n'a pas aidé moi.
Comme le Pakistan avait fait le choix de pousser l'ethnie Pashtun.
Pakistan encouraged ethnic Pashtuns to oppose other ethnic groups in Afghanistan.
Partageait 85.
So 90% of U.S. aid coming through Pakistan was shared out by the Pakistanis between 5 or 6 Pashtun groups.
Entre 5 de ces 6 groupes. C'est pourquoi les Tadjiks.
This is the reason why the Tajiks began to unite around their leader Ismail Khan in Herat, and Massoud, who is a Tajik, in the northeast of the country. They distanced themselves from Pakistan, understanding, as Massoud eloquently put it, that the Pakistanis were confiscating our resistance. We will only get serious material if we ally with Pakistan, and we don't want to.
While Massoud was standing up to the Red Army without American aid, in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. The new Kremlin boss would weigh heavily on the fate of his own country, but also that of Afghanistan.
When Gorbachev came to power and perestroika began, he understood, or rather I think someone told him, that 6 years in Afghanistan was much too long for our troops. And it was much too costly, too. Material, financial, moral and human resources were exhausted. And it was terrible for us and our country. The worst thing was that we often heard at the time, even inside the Soviet Union, that in 6 years we still hadn't won the slightest victory in Afghanistan.
With Gorbachev backing him, Gromov saw in Massoud a possible interlocutor in negotiating a withdrawal in good order. This would preserve a good part of the former Afghan regime, and it would also ensure the Soviet Union of the neutrality of the new regime that would replace Najibullah. For this, Gromov and the Soviet Union needed a middleman, and that was Massoud.
Ahmad Shah Massoud was an extraordinary character. We never met in Panjshir, always on neutral ground, like on the main road between Kabul and the Salang Pass, where the Panjshir Valley begins. We always agreed on a precise place. I would arrive an hour beforehand by helicopter, and he would turn up on horseback or in a jeep, always accompanied by 2 or 3 of his guards, of course. We had 2 real meetings, one in 1987, and the second just before our withdrawal early in 1989. We also wrote each other letters, which went back and forth very quickly, as we had men especially tasked with this. Our conversations aimed to find solutions to avoid bloodshed and to guarantee a smooth withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghan soil.
We knew that talks were going on, and the fact that Soviet military high command was negotiating with the resistance group greatly increased Massoud's prestige, to the great displeasure of Pakistan.
Aux grandes dames du Pakistan.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи. Заявление советского правительства. Действуя в точном соответствии с Женевскими соглашениями, СССР завершил вывод советских войск из Афганистана. в этой стране не осталось ни одного советского солдата.
Despite the departure of the Soviets, Massoud remained simply the head of his ethnic group, the Tajiks, which accounted for a third of the Afghan population. The majority was made up of ethnic Pashtuns. The Pashtuns occupied the south and east of the country and were backed by Pakistan. Massoud hadn't won the war alone. Lots of other brave Tajik, Hazara, and Pashtun commanders fought like him and contributed to the victory over the Red Army. And yet, it was indeed Massoud the Tajik, the Lion of Panjshir, who was singled out as the victor. Not because he was the best, or because the Western press had made him a hero, but because he represented the most reliable and least corruptible warlord in the eyes of the Soviets and President Najibullah's communist government in Kabul. A role that certain Pashtun warlords refused to recognize, such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Massoud's sworn enemy.
And my father was one of the very few and the main figure who actually, when he entered Kabul, and he said that everyone is forgiven, from the military commanders to the soldiers of the regime, the communist regime. It was a war that Afghanistan have passed, that we need to keep the framework of the Afghanistan army, that we should have not really look and seek for revenge. It is time for unity, for humanity, and it is night for reconstruction and rebuilding the country. But unfortunately, it did not happen.
When I met him again, 11 years later in 1992 in Kabul, he wasn't the same man. With all the worry, he had developed a frown. He was completely stressed out, extremely anxious, and obsessed about avoiding a bloodbath in Kabul.
Trêve de courte durée, le temps d'un appel à la prière. Les familles de Kaboulis quittent ce quartier moderne de Micro-Rayan, près de l'aéroport. Le commandant Massoud, le nouvel homme fort de Kaboul, les a fait prévenir qu'une opération militaire allait être menée contre les fondamentalistes du SB islami qui occupent certains de ces immeubles. Kaboul est aujourd'hui coupé par un front sur la ligne de partage entre les Moudjahidines du nord et ceux du SB islami, mieux implantés au sud. Les hommes de Massoud ont repris hier cette position qui surplombe l'aéroport de Kaboul, d'où décollent des MiG, aujourd'hui sous les ordres de Massoud. De ce point élevé, ils pilonnent à la DCA la colline d'en face, au sud, occupée par le SB islami. Allahu Akbar, crient les artilleurs, Dieu est grand. Pourtant, ils ne font plus la djihad, la guerre sainte, car ils se battent contre d'autres moudjahidines, les hommes de Gulbuddin. 14 ans de guerre, les enfants n'ont rien connu d'autre. Nous rejetons ces combats stupides qui n'ont aucun sens. Des milliers de gens sont déjà morts et enterrés. Personne ne nous aide. Les Kaboulis croyaient la guerre enfin terminée. En fait, avec l'arrivée des Moudjahidines, la guerre est entrée dans Kaboul. Et encore une fois, ce sont les populations civiles qui font les frais des intolérances et des dogmatismes.
I said, war's coming to Kabul. Later I thought maybe I had exaggerated, but I hadn't. War did come to Kabul. When Christophe went back a few years later, the city was in ruins. It was a north versus south war, a war between Gulbuddin and Massoud, and the war between Pashtuns and Tajiks entered Kabul.
It was my first report from Afghanistan. His French was less fluent than his followers claimed, but it was enough for simple exchanges. He said, "How are you? Sit down. I'll pray and we'll talk afterwards." When I asked him about political issues, unification and reconciliation, he recited his answers a bit like on automatic pilot. But when we talked of a battle, a conquest, tactics, strategy, etc., his face lit up and he started talking faster. And I thought that deep down, no matter what the Massoud worshippers in France or elsewhere might say, he would always be a Tajik warlord, that it was his identity. But he understood that regarding the outside world and the aid he was requesting, he had to appear as something different. But personally, I never believed that Massoud could be the uncontested unifier of the Afghan mosaic.
Far from the mountains of Panjshir, Massoud failed to bring peace to Kabul, despite his sworn enemy, the Pakistan-backed Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's own failure to control the capital. In 1996, after 4 years of civil war, Massoud abandoned Kabul, a city of ruins and desolation.
It was at that time that another group, with the help of Pakistan, called Taliban, they emerged. But the Taliban, they had one thing in mind, a full takeover. So it was by the help of the Pakistan the Taliban came.
Les Taliban avaient pour but
The Taliban's aim was to install in Kabul a power which would cease to be a power, because it would entail the disintegration of the Afghan state, to make it a Pakistani protectorate, because that was the aim. Everything that came about from the deployment of this aim wasn't the reason for radicalization. Radicalization was already there.
The Taliban, by name, theoretically students of religion, are in fact ultra-radical Islamist militiamen. I followed their advance from Kandahar, and what struck me the most at the time was how many towns fell like ripe apples. They conquered them without fighting. We wondered what was going on. They embodied the most backward-looking form of Islam that existed, the most coercive you could imagine, and yet they were practically welcomed as liberators. When discussing this with Afghans, I finally understood. They said they were sick of the rival exactions of all the rotten militia, racketeering, kidnappings, rapes, pillaging, etc. We might not share Mullah Omar's ideology, but at least with the Taliban there's law and order, security and less corruption. And that explains how they basically strolled into the capital's outskirts.
Now backed by Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization of Osama bin Laden, the Taliban soon controlled 90% of Afghanistan. In the face of the barbarity of the Taliban, who held stonings and executions in stadiums, forbade children from flying kites and listening to music, and forced all women to wear the burqa in the name of their interpretation of the Quran, once again, Massoud alone became the man everybody loved, the resistance fighter who symbolized freedom. Like in the days of the Soviets, he remobilized his valley and took up the flame of resistance.
I had never seen Massoud so much back to his old self as when he became the Tajik warlord, deeply attached to his people and country, especially the Panjshir Valley, which he knew inside out. And I wonder, when reading through my notes from the time, especially our interviews, whether he might even have felt a sense of relief.
هو الذي يصلي عليكم وملائكته ليخرجكم من الظلمات إلى النور.
و پاکستان و باقی کشورهای دیگه که در رقبش هستن به این نتیجه برسن که دیگه جنگ راه حل در افغانستان است. با جنگ نمیتونن هیچ چیزی را حل بکنن. و به این ترتیب زمینه از این مساعد شود که جلو جنگ و خونریزی در افغانستان گرفته شود. چند نکته مثبت است. اول یک، افکار مردم کلاً آماده است. وقتی که بسطها موسفید بخواد که سلاح بگیره در برابر طالب بجنگه بساطها زن و مرد آدم آماده باشه باور کنی اگر در دوران روس قدر آمادگی.
L'Express called me, and they said they wanted to do a long interview with Massoud. And they asked if I was interested. Of course I was. So I left with Vincent Hugues, the special correspondent at L'Express for Tajikistan, which was the back way in. And we spent 2 weeks with him. Every day.
Pascal and I witnessed an incredible scene, which I won't forget until my dying day. There was a front line at Bangui, near Taloqan, which is a strategic position on the Kabul road. It had been recaptured a month before, but was under attack, and there was a real risk. We were up on some kind of outcrop, and between 8 in the morning and 4 or 5 in the afternoon, we witnessed how the great puppeteer Massoud would use the invisible strings that wove his military genius to change the course of battle.
Avec les fils invisibles qu'ont tissé son génie militaire, va inverser le cours d'une bataille. C'est-à-dire qu'au début,
he had a satellite phone and a radio, and suddenly one of his officers called.
Massoud contacte ses commandants, c'est la panique.
They were in a state of panic at the front.
Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar, we're going to die. It's all over, chief.
C'est fini. Et lui, les
and he called them.
Jamshed, Obaid, etc. L'un après l'autre.
Jamshed, Obaid, etc. One by one, and reassured them. He knew the layout down there back to front. We were miles away, but he gave orders to reposition his men.
At one point, he was on his radio with one of his officers at the front. And we heard the officer shout, Allahu Akbar, and bang. We realized that something terrible had happened to the officer. And for the next half hour, Massoud was switching between his satellite phone and his radio, trying to contact the officer. But in vain. And at that moment, I took this photo. He's waiting, hoping that the officer will come online, pacing back and forth, doing nothing else, all alone. Then suddenly, the officer's voice came over the radio. Massoud repeated his instructions from earlier, put down his radio, and went off to pray.
Over the next few hours, we sensed that the course of the battle was changing, and around 4:30, 5 o'clock, they fought off the attack and Taloqan was saved.
I think I was able to enter into his intimacy while keeping my distance. It's a photo I like a lot.
Did the man impress me? Of course he did. He had an inner fire, something inside burning away. His eyes had a kind of gentleness, but they could suddenly display a fierce anger. There was something unique about him. I've met very few people who have had such an effect on me. At the same time, I've always refused to wear the Massoud Forever t-shirt.
Massoud, the resistance fighter, embodied the image of the friendly rebel fighting for a just cause. Through the Taliban's exactions, he regained his legitimacy and once again became the focus of media attention. Massoud had become more than just a resistance fighter, and reporters across the globe dressed him up in the stuff of heroes. A prisoner of his own image, in the spotlight, he became a genuine instrument of communication. And yet, he made sure to uphold his own values.
The reason people were interested in him was that he did things that no others did in terms of strategy, courage, ideas. He was a pretty amazing guy all the same.
People who didn't know him had classic aspirations. The need for an icon, a hero, a Che Guevara figure, a Nelson Mandela, a rebel, David versus Goliath. But let's be clear, beyond the heroization of the rebel figure, there was his appearance, his look. He wasn't a rebel wearing dusty old camouflage. When I met him in the flesh, I noticed that his shell jacket was extremely well cut, made in London. He wore a Longines wristwatch, which not everyone can afford. Even the quirky way he angled his hat, his pacol, held a lot of meaning. So it's no surprise that he ticked all the boxes of the modern hero.
For me, the pacol is a symbol. It is not for me just to look like my father, but it's a symbol. His image, it brings joy, hope, courage to the people of Afghanistan.
Massoud visited the West for the first time in April 2001. With his commitment to freedom, he put on his resistance costume and made a stopover in Paris. While his friends and supporters gave him a welcome worthy of a head of state, curiously, French leaders ignored him. Massoud was only accorded a brief meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hubert Védrine.
In 2001, he could have been given a better welcome in France. He was received by the European Parliament, but in France, neither the President nor the Prime Minister met with him. It was a real shame because the message he brought would have interested them. And his message was, be careful about what's about to happen. It was clearly premonitory.
It was only in Strasbourg at the European Parliament, which had officially invited Massoud, that his message was heard, listened to, and taken seriously.
Soyez le bienvenu au Parlement européen. Très heureuse de vous accueillir.
همه در جریان هستند که گروهی که فعلا در افغانستان به نام طالبان قرار دارند یا دارای افکار و دارای نظریات به خصوص از اسلام هستند. گروه‌هایی که یارم همراهی میکنند مثل اسامه بن لادن، طالبای پاکستانی افکار مشابه به هم دارند. من میخوایم که از این طریق بگویم که تنها هدف از این گروه‌ها افغانستان نه، بلکه اهداف از او قدم اول افغانستان است، بعد خارج از افغانستان. و با کمال تأسف باید یادآوری کنم که در عقب همچو گروه‌ها با همچو افکار افراطی که دارند رژیم پاکستان و دستگاه استخباراتی آیسای پاکستان قرار دارد.
He came to the France to pass this message. He came and he tried, he warned the world of the rise of extremism and terrorism, but the people and the country and the world did not listen and they didn't realize it. When they realized it, it was too late.
It was undoubtedly to do with realpolitik, the desire to please a trade partner, in this case, arms and Pakistan. We know that there were very substantial contracts being negotiated, and we also know that Pakistani diplomacy was working very hard on its own interests with its trade partners. Basically, it was, don't enter into any kind of venture with this Tajik poet. Think about jobs in your country and about selling your weapons.
The Pakistani Secret Service was mortified that Massoud had come to Europe and addressed the European Parliament in Strasbourg in the spring of 2001. He needed to be brought down. He was a different voice for Afghanistan than that of the Taliban, in power since 1996. He gave an alternative view. You can criticize certain things about the man, you can praise certain others, but this new national role was considered too important by bin Laden. So bin Laden had to kill him. And the only way to do that was with a suicide squad.
It was at that time that the Taliban, they really came very close to Panjshir Valley and they were attacking from two sides. And then when my father started constructing a house in his garden, it changed the whole dynamic. It made those propaganda of the Taliban completely zero, their effectiveness completely brought it to zero level. That the people like, well, the Taliban are saying that Ahmad Shah Massoud is leaving, but look at him, he's building a house. No, he's not going anywhere, this is just a lie. And the whole valley started like reconstructing and rebuilding, and they were very hopeful that we are gonna stand, we are going nowhere. We lived in that new house only for 15 days with him. That 15 days is the best time of my life.
I was supposed to leave for France on that day, September the 9th, 2001. The following day, on September 10th, I was due to meet with Nicole Fontaine, the President of the European Parliament. It was 5 or 6 months after our first trip, and Massoud wanted me to update her on the evolution of the situation in Afghanistan.
5 months after Massoud's visit to France, on September 9, 2001, 2 kamikaze terrorists disguised as reporters would carry out an attack on the head of Afghan resistance.
I was about to leave for the airport when I was sadly informed that the commander had been wounded. It was a terrible moment for me, the worst moment in my life.
The head of Panjshir's intelligence network, he came to my grandfather's house. When he used to come, they used to like, oh, Ahmad John, how are you? How are you doing? But this time he didn't say anything. As soon as he saw my eyes, he started crying. And he ran inside my grandfather's house. So what? That is weird. And my grandfather, I saw him through the window. They were very far in the living room. I just, from behind the door and behind the window, I was seeing that my grandfather was just, his head was down, that he was doing like this. Just keep like doing like this. And trying to clear like, his tears and stuff. And the head of intelligence, his name was Ashraf. He told my grandfather that something happened. He's injured. I remember my mother, she just sat down. And still to this day, I remember her face. That she was just looking at the wall, and slowly, slowly, the tears was coming down. And I remember my mother said just one word. No, he's not injured. He's no longer here. That's it. She knew. And she said, Ahmad Shah Massoud would not just get injured. That's it.
When I heard that the commander was wounded, I immediately started trying to organize having him airlifted to France for treatment. I had only just started making calls when I was informed he was dead. But we couldn't allow the information to get out. It had to remain top secret.
All of the signs, it was indicating that he's no longer. I didn't want to believe it. I was hopeful. I was like, if he's injured, what to do? If he's hurt, what to do? If he cannot longer walk, if he's on wheelchair, I will never let anyone to pull the wheelchair and push it except myself. I'm gonna do it. If he requires his eyes are damaged and he requires sunglasses or something to cover them, I will be the one to clean them all the time. If he cannot walk, or if he cannot see, if he cannot talk, if he cannot hear, I don't care. I love him, and I will serve for the rest of my life, and I'll do anything for him. But I did not want to imagine for 1 second that he is not there anymore. So there was a lot of rumors, there was a lot of different news, and which was a great initiative and a great plan by the companion of my father to keep it, hidden from even us, that they didn't really reveal it in one day because it would demoralize everyone. And what happened was that after a few days, we couldn't handle it anymore because this news was killing us.
We heard the confirmation on the radio on Voice of America. When we learned that a plane had crashed into one of the Twin Towers in New York, I guessed it was an accident. But I was on the road, going to fetch Massoud's body, when we heard a second plane had hit the other tower. Then a third at the Pentagon. I leapt from my seat. I was in shock, especially after our own attack on September 9th. We immediately said it was a terrorist attack. We were certain of it. And most probably the work of Al-Qaeda. Then a few days later, it was confirmed.
While the entire planet was in shock over the terror attacks in New York and Washington, 4 days later, the inhabitants of northern Afghanistan converged en masse on the Panjshir Valley. By truck, on horseback, or on foot, tens of thousands of people came from all over the region to pay their last respects to their leader, Commander Massoud. His son Ahmad became, in spite of himself, the mascot, the new hope of an entire people.
So for me, what I realized was that Ahmad Shah Massoud is not just that body. Ahmad Shah Massoud is not just one man. Ahmad Shah Massoud is far, far greater than just one man or one body. That now he transferred into a vision, into an emotion, and to a love and a passion that will run through the bloods of whoever loves freedom and justice.
The two attacks were inextricably linked because before 9/11, Al-Qaeda wanted to wipe out the leader of the resistance in the hope of wiping out all resistance in Afghanistan.
It's true that Massoud's death, which was planned in the aftermath of his intervention in Strasbourg, had the aim of destroying all organized resistance on Afghan soil. And this was before the 9/11 attacks would inevitably provoke an incredibly serious American riposte. Killing Massoud would ensure that the Americans didn't have a contact on the ground.
After Massoud, Afghanistan, the kingdom of insolence, began a kind of descent into hell. It had hardly been paradise beforehand, far from it. But a kind of infernal mechanism clicked into action. The American invasion, their riposte to 9/11, the fall of the Taliban regime, the installing of a fleetingly legitimate government embodied by Ahmed Karzai, all the way to the withdrawal engineered by Donald Trump, which, however you look at it, handed the keys to the trucks back to the Taliban. In April 2001, the Chief of Staff of the US Army, Mark Milley, made an official declaration when answering the question about Afghanistan's future, when he said, the fall of Kabul isn't inevitable, but possible. In other words, a return to power for the Taliban. And then this extraordinary statement, which I'll quote. In the worst-case scenario, we will witness the collapse of the Afghan army, civil war, a humanitarian disaster, and the return in force of Al-Qaeda. All I can say to the whole of the West is, great job.
A year after his father's death, Ahmad Massoud went into exile in Iran with his mother and 5 sisters. Then he studied at the Sandhurst Royal Military Academy in the United Kingdom, before obtaining a degree in war studies at the prestigious King's College London, then a master's degree in international politics at City University of London.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I hope to see you.
In 2017, he returned to Afghanistan and accepted his father's inheritance.
Massoud's son is almost a physical clone of his father, and he has the same generosity, the same selflessness, and the same patriotism. He doesn't have the same experience, and he hasn't made his mark on the battlefield where Afghan chiefs forged their reputations. And I don't think he'll cure the fundamental disease of Afghan society. This, of course, is its division into clans, ethnic groups, and sects.
To me, an inheritance like his is both a priceless treasure and a terrible burden. And when you end up being known as the son of, the burden generally ends up being heavier than the treasure. If I had to sum up this inheritance today, I'd say, at the risk of sounding paradoxical, that it is a formidable, unfinished epic. Massoud will go down as one of the greatest rebels in history, and not all rebels in history succeed.
Today of Afghanistan requires the same Ahmad Shah Massoud. One thing is that I'm not Ahmad Shah Massoud, and I will never be. He was that charismatic leader, that he was born of that situation and that time, that he did an amazing job. We are following the exact footstep of him to implement his visions and his belief by not copying his just appearance, by really giving people hope and courage just to say that we will do in our own capacity. He had a different capacity, we have our own capacity, but in exactly same direction. I hope and I pray for God to help me to be able to do something good for my country, and maybe I will be successful, maybe I will not. But I will not stop trying, and I will never stop trying and making those dreams of him come into reality.